Welcome back to everybody who's tuning in. We'll be starting with the next panel for the day, Running Blind Overtrust in Tech. I will hand over to Kaja, who is moderating this panel. Over to you, Kaja.
Thank you very much. We are a couple of panelists short at the moment, but we're hopeful that they will join in a minute or two as we get over some of the technical difficulties. But we want to start as we only have 45 minutes to get us through this. And it is a big topic we're trying to address. We're trying to discuss and shed some light on the question of running blind over trust in tech, which will talk, where we'll talk about how humans in certain conditions inherently trust decisions made by machines more than those made by humans, and sometimes at the cost of our independent human judgment. More critically, oftentimes we are not even aware that this is happening, but perceive it as neutral and without bias. So today we will talk about whether this is true. Is this where we are? Is this our future? And try and discuss what could be done about it. In joining us, we will have eventually 5 panelists. Eli Sugarman, who's here, who's head of the cyber initiatives at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Alex Klimburg, director of cyber policy and resiliency program at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. Apar Gupta, executive director, Internet Freedom Foundation. Marietje Schaake, international policy director, Stanford Cyber Policy Center and president of the Cyber Peace Institute. Basie van Solms, director of the University of Johannesburg Center for Cybersecurity. So a high level and very experienced panel. And maybe we start us off with the question of what is the situation today? How much power do algorithms really have? And are we too far down the path of towards the world of the science fiction? Does anyone want to take it? Alex, I see you nodding.
I wasn't nodding, but thank you anyway, Kaja. Thanks for the invite to the organizers. It's great to be back, even only in a virtual context. Going first also allows me to quote Lawrence Lessing first, code is law, since it was going to come up eventually. But I'd also like to say that Lawrence Lessing's quote 20 years after it was first made needs to be questioned a little bit. So while it was possible to opt out of the internet in the year 2000, you can't really opt out of cyberspace today. So I think part of the question that we need to ask is some of our old beliefs, which effectively was code is law, and that should be first in all of our considerations, if that is still something that we should abide by. And in fact, the question needs to be posed, do policy considerations, the ethical considerations need to be included in an earlier stage in technology? The second question I think that is related to that is that we sometimes also in a manufacturing context trust in code without checking it. Just to give you one example, in the context of the Global Commission of Stability of Cyberspace, we actually have a norm number 6, which calls on developers to take especially care when reusing code from other suppliers, because sometimes they are reusing code that is faulty. And that is part of the problem in the larger trust ecosystem, is that also not only do users sometimes have to engage in a trust relationship, manufacturers have to engage in a trust relationship. And we don't always verify when we engage in a trust relationship. So manufacturers, for instance, will pick up existing code, integrate it into their products, and sometimes therefore reuse vulnerable code that has already been patched 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and end up suffering the consequences. So this is part of the problem. It's not only a question that applies to users, it also is a question that applies to manufacturing. And I think we both need to understand that trust is incomplete without verification.
I will unmute myself.
There you go.
Those are some excellent points. I actually want to parse a little bit in the second round of almost discussion to try and see what should we do about where we are. But I wanted to also see, Apar, Eli, do you think that this is where, do you agree with Alex that we trust in code slightly too much?
I'm happy to jump in if that's all right, and just to sort of echo Alex's thanks to Kaja for moderating, to Sci-Fi for hosting this, to the team there, Samir, Trisha, Anushka, really thank you for this opportunity. You know, I think there is a big issue here at play, which is I think a lot of consumers and users of the internet don't understand how it works really at all, and so there's a real lack of understanding of the technology. And oftentimes when we don't understand something, especially a complex system, one of two things can happen. One is we get really scared and concerned and freaked out to some degree, right? And worried about what is happening, how are decisions being made, what does this mean? Or to some extent we sort of lean in and embrace it and assume it's working fairly and in a good way and serving our interests and really serving our benefit. And I think that's to some degree where we're at now, where the lack of fundamental understanding of the technology, how the system works, how the different digital technologies then connect online to access data, and then as that permeates down different layers of our lives, it does add up to something potentially concerning, because we do assume that the system is working properly and it is balancing all of our concerns. And that's not always the case, right? And so some of the algorithms, some of the technologies we use, I think are problematic, but I think it also depends on different technologies, different parts of our daily experience. But I do think there's a bigger issue there, which is a lot of people just fundamentally don't understand how any of this works and are sort of hoping it's working out well, and it isn't always working out well. And so I do think there's something to what Alex is saying, that we do need to go deeper. We do need to think about the ethical, the policy, the other implications of a lot of these technologies. And unfortunately, most of our societies aren't there yet, right? There isn't a deep, sophisticated, strategic understanding of them. And all you need to do is look at the conversation in the United States that's happening daily on Section 230 or whatever piece of law or regulation about a technology to see really how superficial that understanding is, and that's concerning.
And Eli, just because it is a global audience, what is Section 230?
Sorry, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act really is sort of the intermediary liability law in the United States that really protects platforms that host user-generated content to basically keep that content up without basically suffering adverse legal consequence in most circumstances. So it's really to promote open expression and innovation, and is really what has fundamentally helped a lot of the major platforms and technologies that users around the world use grow. Although now we are seeing what happens perhaps when there aren't enough limitations on the kinds of content and what happens when certain problematic content is spread.
And I think maybe, on what you were saying, I would try and parse it even more, right? I think there's a question of the general user understanding the technology they're using and sort of the options that are presented or not presented to them as they're using it. There is the regulatory perspective of, do we have policymakers who are able to provide efficient and effective oversight? But in reality, I think there's also a question of just an engineering technology development perspective. Humans have flaws. Bias is the most, I think, prominent one in these discussions. Do we actually know what bias goes into developing some of these codes? So can we as humans really fix the flaws of the technology? Although now I feel I've gotten very philosophical. But I saw Basie has also joined, so I wanted to see whether he or Apar wanted to sort of dive into this first round of what is the state of play today.
Be happy to go ahead just to also provide a much more granular basis to how audiences in India are looking at it. While the audience is global, a large part of that is also in India. So just taking two very contextual examples here, the first of DNA-based evidence and the second of camera-based evidence and how it's being utilized in courts. We have judgments which are coming to courts in which they are stating that this is the best evidence, it can't be faulted, which actually goes over and above established processes of trial in which human testimony used to be the standard earlier, in which lawyers used to take in evidence, cross-examine witnesses. And the problem which is occurring quite often in terms of the level of trust which is being placed in the technology is that the criticality which helps the trust actually improve is sometimes inhibited at the very first instance itself. Because if you look at, for instance, DNA-based technologies, if you just say it's infallible and you don't get into it a bit more deeply, then by itself, that technology will not improve over the longer course of time in terms of how it plays in. So I think also not only from a user perspective, but also from a governance perspective, also our legal regulation is crafted quite often, and the level of trust which is accommodated, especially in legal frameworks sometimes, to how technology plays with aspects of service delivery or with the aspects of justice or determination by itself, is to a very, very high degree present in just in terms of what we are seeing in law enforcement in India, in entitlement distribution in India. So I do think so that the fundamental premise of this panel of overtrust in technology is correct, and it does require criticality. And I'm hoping that other panelists can look towards solutions, and I can learn from them as we take this conversation forward.
Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much to the organizers also for asking me to be part of this very distinguished panel. Let me start off by saying I'm a technologist. I'm not in the policy side. I look at the technology as such. And from my viewpoint, I think the title of this panel is very adept, very good, but from another view. It says, are we running blind? I think, personally, we are running blind in the sense that the ordinary end user, and we see that specifically in Africa, the ordinary end user has got no cybersecurity awareness or very little. They are catapulted into an environment of using a smartphone, for example. So they're running blind. They haven't got any background or very little about the risks of cyberspace, about the risks of money transfers, etc., and to a big extent, the devices, mostly smartphones, are sold and implemented. And the settings are done by the supplier because the user has got no knowledge, and that helps the user, or that causes that the user is running blind. And I think that's one of the major things we'll have to look at in the upcoming fourth industrial revolution. Everybody is talking about all these new skills we're going to need and all these new jobs we're going to create. I personally think, and I'm again talking from a development country view, is that we are only maybe starting in the third industrial revolution as far as cybersecurity awareness is concerned. And I think that must need large, massive, international, national emphasis so that our users, who's going to be majorly impacted by developments in the fourth industrial environment, are ready, not technologically ready, but awareness ready. And I think cybercrime, there was a report the other day about South Africa, where I come from, a very international research company, saying that South Africa is the third highest number of cyber victims in the world. And then they say one of the main reasons that they did in the investigation is the naivety of the end user. So my angle, you will see, is we allow, to a big extent, our users to run blind, and we have to look after them. Governments will have to look after them as we roll out new technologies.
So I worry that we are all in a level of agreement in terms of where we are today, which is we basically don't know enough about technology. I think the panelists kind of touched upon the different parts of the problem that we have here, whether it is the question of user awareness, whether it's the question of cybersecurity, whether it's the question of bias, whether there's a question of oversight, and if we have this fundamental problem, so what can we do about it? I feel with that, we start the second round of trying to figure out what the solutions are.
Just a last comment, Kaja, before I give over to the next panel. I think we shouldn't, and you said it, and I think we should be careful. cybersecurity and cybersecurity awareness are not two things. They are the same thing. It's proven that the best way to run cybersecurity, or one of the best tools you could use to cybersecure your company, is through cybersecurity awareness. But we'll come back to that in the rest of the discussion. I'd like to hear what the other panel members say.
Alex?
So Kaja, I'll then continue in that vein. Since you asked for specific recommendations, I'd have three. I would first start off with where we were beforehand, is that I think coding loops, so any type of actual coding, needs to be increasingly open to take into account policy and human rights questions. Normally, when you go, for instance, to an IATF meeting or similar, those don't really feature highly. And if you look at the history of such meetings and what happens, for instance, take one example, for instance, is around IPv6, for instance, there were a couple of very interesting developments that would have had very serious implications for human rights concern, but they were only caught rather late in the development of IPv6. These types of concerns need to be addressed earlier. It's not that they should be center. I think the engineering should remain engineering, but there has to be a way to regularly input these questions and provide feedback so that these products don't hit the market in a dubious state. Second of all, manufacturers, and that also includes the companies that run these algorithms, have to take responsibility for the entirety of their code base. This includes code that they have, for instance, repurposed and which might be vulnerable and which they then try to pass on responsibility for. We've seen that happen. Just to give you one example, Tesla is part of their entertainment system, uses a browser that has been vulnerable for over 5 or 7 years now. So there are baked-in vulnerabilities in many smart cars right now, and the manufacturers just pass off responsibility. And the same thing sometimes also applies to algorithms. Although the last year or 2 years, we've seen a change in the way companies discuss the algorithms. They used to effectively treat them as a natural occurrence they have no control over. I think it's important that we do understand that algorithms have effects, and that companies should basically take into account what those effects mean. And finally, most importantly, it's been mentioned 3 times already, but it can't be said enough, we have to increase the level of cyber literacy. It's a little bit like understanding finance. Everybody does not need to understand the ups and downs of LIBOR, for instance, or the currency fluctuations of the world market, but you need to know how, if your mortgage is going to go up or down. You need to have a basic literacy to be able to engage in this. And we need to basically tackle this as an education matter at the very basic level of secondary education, all the way up to the expert levels, C-levels in companies, as well as policymakers. There is no end of work to be done here, and if we don't do it, we're constantly going to be surprised.
Eli and Apar, any response? And also, I know,
Sure, yeah.
Apar, you kind of disappeared in the middle.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and really, I think, sort of build off that last point Alex said about literacy and whether you want to call it literacy, awareness, education. I think they're all interrelated and all critical. And I think it's right to think about, different individuals have different roles and different needs of knowledge, right? It's like not everybody needs to be the same kind of expert or have the same level of knowledge about finance or whatever the system is we're talking about. But I do think the challenge here is you do need more basic education about how the technology works, how it can work well, how it can be used to do harm, so that people make better decisions. And that is a generational exercise, right? Like to really get people thinking smartly about what's in their interest, the interest of their community, society, you need to bake it in early and give them a lot of time to think about it and make it part of their regular routine and what they think about. And you need to do that all the way up to then the policymaker, right? The member of parliament, the minister of government, the C-suite executive. They need to fundamentally re-architect their framework for thinking about these issues so that they better understand the technology, but then say, okay, this is what the technology could do. I live in a democratic society where different values that I hold dear, whether I live in South Africa, India, the US, Austria, wherever, we have different notions of security, different notions of privacy and fundamental liberties, different notions of commercial competitiveness and innovation, and they're all in tension. You cannot optimize all of them at the same time in any given technology or any given situation. And so we need to get much more sophisticated at that level, at the decision makers we defer to in society to really think through over the long run. Okay, well, maybe there are some people trying to use this technology to harm us. They're radicalizing people online. Maybe we do need some intrusive surveillance. but then what are the implications for fundamental liberties, and how do I set that balance? And right now, I feel that from the average internet user all the way up the stack to the decision maker, we don't have the level of knowledge and sophistication and thinking that we need. And it's really an indictment of our leaders, of our education system, of everybody to say that these technologies now are so pivotal that we really need to consider them in the same way we think about just like basic conversation, basic education, and really resource them more and really make sure we're doing the best to what Basie got out, which is we need to use quantitative information, data to drive how we're doing this. And there is actually some best practice that isn't actually used as much as it should be and followed. So let me stop there.
No, I think I would also be, again, in violent agreement. My question is almost, what do we do in the more immediate term? Because I agree with you. I think this is a long-term process before we get there. But the technology is here and is ever more persuasive, right? I think pervasive. If you, just from a Microsoft perspective, to talk from sort of our company's perspective, the acceleration of online adoption, of technology adoption in the last 6 months since the crisis has been unprecedented, right? The speed unheard of, and that has obviously allowed us to socially distance and hopefully be a little more secure in our health, but at the same time has meant that a lot of people, a lot of organizations have gone online completely unprepared, not just from the cybersecurity perspective, as was mentioned, but just from a perspective of understanding what some of the technologies they're using actually have behind. So how do we also look at, in the near term, incentivizing companies to invest in algorithms that are transparent, that are sensible, I guess. That's probably not the word, trustworthy, but also ensuring, Alex, you mentioned about the need to have greater conversations to bring in human rights and other perspective, but how do you also balance the fact that, for instance, a company might want to develop an algorithm that sells something to you, because the typical case, you need to click on something, it needs to be a clickbait. But what does that mean for the society in the long run? How do we make sure that companies act now, but also act with the long-term perspective in mind?
Well,
so thanks for the oh, please, by all means.
Can I add to what you're saying, Kaja? And I think it's a serious problem, and it's not only a problem that we're running into now. I think information security, cybersecurity has always been a problem. And I really think, listening to some of the other panelists, there is a lot of advancement in some more developed countries. But I'm really worried about the algorithm issue, because that's going to drive the fourth industrial revolution. And we just have to trust it. There's no way we can have a complex algorithm explained to the end user. It's not possible. So yes, we will have to hold the developers accountable. But that's, again, it's not so easy. If you look at the code bases of many of our big systems, they are so complex that there's no way to testing them. So you are really running blind. I like the title. We're running blind, and I think we're going to get even in more dark spaces in many areas. And again, the fourth industrial revolution, where we are going to expose to lots of other aspects. Just look at the whole Internet of Things. Every one of us in our homes are being infiltrated, call it like that, by devices, by sensors. We've got no idea how secure those sensors are. They are being sold to us. They are built into the products that we buy. So, I'm not negative. I've been in this field for 50 years. I've started looking at information security in 1970. And I don't see a solution. I don't see a solution in the sense that, as far as I'm concerned, and I come back to what I said at the beginning, we must create this healthy criticism this healthy cynicism to a certain extent amongst users as far as security, as far as new systems are concerned. Don't trust them. You can never trust them because no system can ever be 100% safe. So I know I'm talking in circles, but I really appreciate the input from the panelists that we can come up with realistic proposals to a certain extent. And maybe we have to have a follow-up panel on this issue. But we're moving into dark areas, I'm no doubt about it, into dangerous waters with all the artificial intelligence, with all the machine learning that we are going to develop in years to come. And we have to get the user on our side, the end user, right as some of the panelists have said, right from undergraduate, from preschool level to the policymakers. And we are not yet there. We're really not there.
So I like the idea of healthy cynicism, although it terrifies me. But Alex, you also wanted to make a point.
Sure. So coming back to your question, I think there are effectively multi-stakeholder frameworks that try to tackle these questions in partnership. So this is particularly the case within artificial intelligence and algorithmic-based decision-making contexts, but they also exist in other types of areas of coding and engineering. But I think it's important that these partnerships be real, and not that they be fake marketing exercises, or even if they're only perceived as such. And just recently, for instance, Access Now, the human rights organization, left an AI partnership because they complained that industry was driving the discussion completely, and that human rights organizations like themselves not only were not able to get any of their points considered, but they were basically being used as a fig leaf. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but it basically shows that when businesses and governments engage in these types of outreach activities, try to do a multi-stakeholder approach where government, the private sector, and civil society really do engage together, it needs to be an honest effort, and it can't be conceived of as a marketing exercise, because if it does, then it backfires and it further weakens the entire ecosystem.
I would agree with that. I would also probably say it actually is probably very difficult because I think even just having a conversation I sit in a policy shop of a tech giant effectively. I very rarely interact with the engineering departments, and having that conversations with external stakeholders, which is in this case something that would have to happen, would be difficult. Apar?
I've been listening with incredible amounts of interest, and I think the primary recommendation which is coming through is in terms of user education from Alex, which I think happens over a period of time through adoption, but poses unique challenges, especially in societies where the smartphone is immediately made available for access towards services. So there are issues of literacy, there are issues where people think what's on the screen is essentially what is everything. So that kind of ecosystem itself governs the interaction quite often. And I think this very nicely builds into what Eli was saying as well, which that we do need to think through how much adoption we are doing, at what rates of adoption are actually being done, for what areas of adoption are being done with respect to technology without understanding the risk. So that kind of healthy criticality is always necessary. But are we doing that any longer? I do think we've entered that phase now, where on sci-fi we have this panel and these questions are being posed. So I think in terms of governance outcomes and in terms of consultation process, especially when we look at India, and there have been a whole range of consultations on how do we create these kind of governance frameworks on data, on algorithms, on artificial intelligence in the past few months. What we have felt has been, and this goes back to Basie's point as well as Alex's point, has been the value of civil society as a stakeholder in that process towards having a much richer perspective come through, which actually represents users, because users by themselves quite often, and this is a fault as well, that these policy dialogues quite often happen at a very high expert level, so the ordinary person just does not know how to engage with them. But still, civil society needs to be there in that room. It doesn't need to be tokenistic, and it needs further capacity building, especially in the global south. From what I see, I think this kind of capacity may exist in parts of Europe, in North America, but may be lacking in other countries. And this may be something which is felt because ultimately, if you look at it, technology deployments which are deployed, let's say in India or in Africa, will be quite distinct. So geographies will also matter here. I just wanted to highlight that as a bit.
No, and I think that's a great point. I think I would probably say there's definitely differences in capacity and understanding. I would love to actually hear from others on the panel as well, just because we are geographically dispersed. But I think from my perspective, I would definitely say that there is not enough awareness. I sit in a developed country, but even with that in mind, it's not just looking at my parents who are elderly or but just looking at the population in general. I just don't think there is awareness, and I don't think it's awareness of cybersecurity, or there's an awareness of biases that are inherent in technology. I would also say that what you just said at the end was exactly right, and in terms of the technology manifests in technology problems and positives manifest themselves differently in different cultural environments, and the fact that there are only a few centers around the world that drive the development of technology inherently sort of predisposes, whatever you want to call it, the outcomes towards those particular locations. We have a question from the audience from Krzysztof Zalewski. I'm going to assume that my Polish is great. That is about digital literacy. And his question is it about the complete change of a school curricula, not just adding new content? And how do you lobby for that? And what are any of the best practices? Is there anyone doing this already?
Well, I can quickly react on that. I totally agree with the question, the question put. We need a change in approach, and I like the concept that several panelists has actually worded in so many words, is we need citizen, call it activism. We need activism from the citizens, the ordinary man, saying, why am I buying products which has got vulnerabilities in and which steals my money or steals my personal data? Why do I have to trust these companies? Let's just quickly look at some other models. Look at the medical model. Why don't companies just develop medicine and sell it to the customer? Because there's an active cynicism amongst the user, saying, I'm not going to use a drug which hasn't been properly tested and approved by the government. But we sell software, we sell algorithms, and the poor user never even had a chance to ask a question concerning how good is this thing? What's the impact on my life going to be? Just speak to parents whose children are totally gone down the drain about social networks. Were they ever asked about this new product? So I think, and I'm very, very excited about the theme I'm seeing coming up from this panel discussion, that yes, we can do something about it, but we must start at the right place. It's no use leaving it to the developers saying, okay, bring out your products, we will buy your products. We must start saying, we want to say in the product, we want to have the product evaluated in some way to ensure our security.
I have views on this, but others?
Yeah, I'm happy to build off that. So I think, so I don't focus on primary education just to sort of, fess up to that. But I do think there are models that you're seeing in different countries, right? And a lot of the educational systems in different countries it's very different, right? Who controls the educational curricula? How involved are parents, local municipalities, decision makers? And so there isn't like one size fit all, where you just have like a turnkey educational solution you can pop in India, then in Austria, then the US, South Africa, wherever, right? So just to say, like, there's contextualized differences. I think in the US you are starting to see this. It is a curricular challenge. You do need to add some new content, right? You do need to teach some skills of digital literacy earlier on that then get more complex, and then people can, in university and postgraduate opportunities really dive deeper. I think what you're seeing right now is, as many know, the U.S. is in the midst of a very contentious election, and one of the skills we're seeing that our citizens don't have is even media literacy and how that intersects with digital literacy, right? And you have the New York Post just basically laundering Russian disinformation in an effort to try to tank one presidential campaign. And some people are buying that. And unfortunately, some of our political class are buying it and creating a narrative of technology companies are censoring free speech. And you're like, there are so many faulty assumptions in that whole logical train that go back to some lack of understanding in digital literacy, but some of it is also purposely wanting to not understand and purposely wanting to sort of galvanize their community against the technology, because in this instance, they're viewing that it doesn't serve their immediate political interest. And so I think there's a very unhealthy connection between some conversations about, what does technology do, who controls it, and how do we educate people to think about it. But just to say that part of what the Hewlett Foundation is doing is saying that there are models of literacy and education that are more broadly scalable at the university and postgraduate level, and supporting some of that education in India, at National Law University of Delhi, for instance, new curricula, universities across Europe and the United States. And I think that the last thing I'll say is it is about digital literacy and a technical understanding and changing user behavior. But given the complexity that it's technology interacting with humans, we always have to be multidisciplinary. So technology alone is not the solution, nor are the social sciences and non-technical disciplines. You really have to bring them together to find a way to connect with people, to change their behavior, and to really influence them. And I do think that the science is getting better, both the social science and the technical sciences, but what really requires is more money from governments to prioritize this stuff and really invest in it and think long-term and to measure its impact. And then, like Kaja said, for companies to invest and to be motivated, and she's not going to say it, but like Microsoft is really investing in civil society and some of these conversations in ways that other companies aren't. And I do think we need to think about how do we get corporations to think about their role as maximizing profit, which is of course part of their goal, but then also serving society and making more sophisticated users who can actually demand better products. And those incentives don't always align. And I don't have an easy solution there, but I do think that's a really interesting thread to pull on. Perhaps if we have the second follow-up panel that the Basie suggested, that I think would be fun.
I also I kind of want to build on that, because I think you're exactly right, and I think there is no easy solutions, otherwise we would have one. But I'm surprised that none of we talked about general user awareness. We kind of alluded to the roles of technology companies, although not in a way that I would have expected. I would have thought there would be more criticism on this panel. But the one thing that I did not hear, and this is the bit where I find interesting, is there was no mention of the need to educate the coders. Right? I think you're right. This is a multidisciplinary problem, but if the coders just go, like we talked about security earlier, like until almost 5 years ago, there's no cybersecurity in engineering schools. So lots of places there still isn't. So how do we ensure there's ethics? How do we ensure there's bias training, long-term, not just at the companies, but at schools? So is that also one solution, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's part of it, and frankly, like we and others are starting to fund that, right? Like you need technologists and coders who are trained in ethics and to think about how the technology is used and how it impacts people for good or for ill. And likewise, you need lawyers who understand the basics of the technology so they can actually ask some of those questions. So you have to work it both ways. And I think part of the challenge is that computer science and engineering curricula in the United States, the accrediting organizations have not prioritized security. They have not prioritized ethics. They've not baked these into the curriculum. And so you need to look to leadership at a university to really prioritize and say, listen, take what MIT is doing, creating a whole new school to basically train a future generation of engineers and computer scientists. Say, there will be an ethical and societal overlay there of this entire new school that'll churn out thousands of people a year to go work around the world. that is a novel approach to fundamentally restructure the curriculum. And they have the luxury of doing that because it's MIT and they can raise $1 billion or $2 billion to do that, right? How you do that even at other institutions in the United States, let alone the rest of the world, is a big challenge. I mean, we're trying to do this by funding a range of university programs, partnering with others to do it, but there's a huge need here. It's a big problem, but just to say, like, yes, you're absolutely right.
So, Kaja, I actually would take up your challenge for a little bit of criticism. First of all, though, I do want to mention that I did say before, twice actually, that the coding loops that we have currently in both open formats like Internet Engineering Task Force, but also in companies, need to be more open to these types of suggestions. And that doesn't mean that the engineers become human rights experts. It's that there are simply input mechanisms for where they can actually input their suggestions without disrupting the entire process completely. And there are actually models for doing this. This isn't out of the box. This is actually something that some responsible coders have already started doing. And it's a very important step, I agree, and especially so when you talk about actually algorithms. I wanted to second of all get to the point regarding education, and I actually do think that as important as it is that companies step in to address some of the digital literacy shortfalls, there is an obvious conflict of interest that does sometimes play out. It's very hard for a company that specializes, for instance, in social media, to actually advocate for curtailing the use of social media. It's not very likely to happen. In some countries in Europe, for instance, gambling companies have to basically say, gamble responsibly, and then you have a lot of government regulation that asks them to please make that more core part of the message. It doesn't really work, and it never really will work. What companies can do, though, and indeed Microsoft has done in the past, with my own personal experience, is engaged in the higher level discussion, more elite discussions where the chances of it inadvertently going into a more corporate direction is curtailed by the level of literacy already there. But where it shouldn't be involved in my opinion, is lower down the stack in basic education. That really needs to be more in academic and civil society, and therefore I also applaud Eli's suggestion previously about civil society being involved, because that is simply where one has to work with nuance. That's just simply very hard to have when one is a profit-oriented enterprise. And in that case, I think just digital literacy is part of secondary education in some countries already, but the question is it enough? And of course it isn't. Also, I think all of us would agree civics is not adequately addressed in most of our secondary education systems. We need a lot more civics education so we can understand what we're dealing with, and that would include media, and that would include technology. But to be very specific in terms of the question that was asked, in Europe, since many European countries for the last 3 decades, we have had basic coding courses as part of secondary education. So you will do maybe a sum total of 30 or 40 hours introduction to Pascal or BASIC or any other sort of coding. What I would like to see is that those courses that still exist actually start talking about how technology is used, not only how to make technology. And that would be one entry into actually having this type of discussion, rather than the current way we do it, for instance, in Austria, where you have somebody fly in and do iPhone and social media security like it's sex education. And it's basically a one-stop thing where they come in, they explain everything is dangerous, and they leave again. There's no real way to engage the students on this issue. So it has to be part of the overall curricula, but I also think it's important to connect it to other issues of wider social concern.
Thank you, Alex. And we were one panelist short, but somehow still managed to almost run out of time. So in the last, I would say 30 seconds, I wanted to see if literally anyone on the panel has like one final takeaway, one only, to leave the audience with.
Well, I will just finish with this comment. We have to take responsibility for the end user. We must look after the end user in whatever way. We have to get them involved in and create a safe environment for them in cyberspace.
Thank you. And I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you, the panel. Thank you, ORF, and thank you, Sci-Fi. And I hope you've all enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much for your chairpersonship.
Thank you, Kaja.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Kaja.